Hello class, I hope you all are doing well, and for everyone who's watching this video outside of our class realm, and I just want to thank you all for just listening to what I had to say. So, what I'm talking about tonight is with my project with story maps is actually plotting the story of how, where, and when abolitionist ministers preach sermons and where they do them. Now, the question is, why is this important? So, I always consider this a very important subject matter because it was, when we study the abolitionist movement in school, and his classes that we took in years past, we just get a general overview of the abolitionist movement. It's like a brief snippet. We hear a little bit about the Underground Railroad, and we might get more extended time with Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, or John Brown, but we don't learn about their writings, what they taught, what they preached, or anything of that sort. So my project is actually composed primarily of sermons come from the white abolitionist Protestant Christian ministers from 1860 to 1865, roughly. And it's very interesting where the locations where they tended to come up most. Now, Boston came up a few times, and that's not so much of a surprise, but some of the other ones like Buffalo, New York, or Cincinnati, it seemed all of them were based. Of course, all of them are based in the North, but with the sample that I did, but it was the points on the map were actually quite scattered. There was like one sermon in Cincinnati, one in Buffalo, New York, Foxborough, Massachusetts, and a lot of other different locations in the north. So it was a very diverse geography in terms of what the map says with plotting the points. So in now with telling the story of abolitionist theology, as I call it, we see the general denunciation of slavery as sin, but that can be manifested in different ways. Um, a number of sermons that I came across called for immediate emancipation, and they didn't call for any sort of reimbursement or anything like that. I know some gradualists were for that kind of thing, but it was definitely an immediate abolition of slavery. Um, and there was some language that actually came up talking about racial equality for African Americans, which was more revolutionary, and here's why I say that. Over the years of my studies on the abolitionist movement, there were a number of abolitionists that were anti slavery, but they weren't necessarily pro civil rights. That's another important reason why I'm doing this, because when we think of the abolitionist movement, we tend to see it as, well, they had it all together, and most of the time they did, but there were deficiencies within the movement that I aim to address where they didn't go far enough overall to address racial equality for African Americans and specific ways of how to communicate that, how to uh, articulate that through sermons and their discourses that we surveyed for our sample. Now, um, along with the way that slavery was denounced as sin in the sermons, there were a number of different approaches to it. One way that they approach that it was approached from is from biblical literalism. So using scripture alone to denounce slavery. Others argued more from, I would say, they pulled from William Lloyd Garrison's playbook and just preached on the spirit of the New Testament. So basically, they a lot of abolitionists denied biblical literalism, and they just relied on they advocated the spirit of the New Testament, that the spirit of the God of the New Testament, just when you read it throughout, just would morally condemn slavery. There's just no way that a God like Jesus would just, even though they say he never spoke out, critics say he never spoke out against slavery, even though he did in Luke chapter 4. um he They just relied on the spirit of the New Testament. And then the other ways that they denounced it as sin was more just from a political or general moral context without necessarily referring to scripture at all. They have like a base text, but then they just talk about the uh, politically destructive consequences of maintaining slavery and that sort of thing. So, some would argue that slavery, some abolitionists said it was like a regional sin, meaning that it was relegated to the South, or they would argue that it was a national sin that all of us are guilty of because of how slavery had some kind of foothold and benefited both respective economies. So, I'm with the story map, I hope that anybody who's reading that will actually take away like how different some of the responses were within the sermons of abolitionist ministers, and how they weren't entirely uniform in the way they denounced it, slavery as sin, and how some may not even have called for racial equality, but some did, by talking about how all people are made in the image of God, or the golden rule. But anybody who reads my project or timeline, you're going to be in for an interesting expose of the abolitionist movement. So thank you all for watching, and I hope you all enjoy the timeline.